In some accounts of Patton's headquarters conversations, a senior officer, a colonel by several tellings, leaned close and said it plainly. Eisenhower had betrayed him. What Patton said next, in the version that has come down through those who served near him, was not what the colonel expected. It was not rage. It was not agreement. It was something harder to carry, and something that reveals more about command, loyalty, and the difference between a wrong decision and a moral crime than almost any exchange recorded in that war. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had achieved something close to the impossible. In roughly 100 days, the armies of the United States, Britain, Canada, and Free France had broken out of Normandy, swept through Paris, and driven the Wehrmacht to the very borders of the Reich itself. The map that had looked so grim in June now showed Allied flags deep into territory Hitler had believed would hold for years. The momentum was staggering. But momentum is not a strategy, and at the highest levels of Allied command, two competing visions were pulling at the same army. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding in the north, argued for a single concentrated thrust into Germany, a narrow blade aimed at the heart of the Reich. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American armies in the center, favored a broader advance along multiple axes. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander, stood above both men, answerable to governments on two continents, to the combined chiefs of staff, to political realities that no battlefield commander could fully see, or was meant to see. And at the southern edge of this vast coalition army, George Patton's Third Army was moving faster than any force in American military history. The colonel who reportedly stood before Patton that autumn was no hothead. He was a professional, a man who had served long enough to understand the machinery of command, who had watched Patton drive his men past exhaustion and past reason, and who believed, as many around him believed, that something had been taken from them that should not have been taken. He was a man of loyalty. That made it worse. And in a private moment, accounts suggest, he said it to Patton's face. To understand what the colonel was feeling, it is necessary to understand what the Third Army had done. From the breakout at Avranches in late July 1944, through the weeks that followed, Patton's forces swept across France with a speed that confounded German commanders and delighted Allied planners. Armored columns covered distances in days that had taken weeks in the hedgerows of Normandy. German divisions were encircled, shattered, or bypassed before they could establish defensive lines. Towns fell. Bridges were seized intact, and Patton managed them from his headquarters with a restless, almost violent energy that drove his staff to near collapse. The German Army Group G, attempting to form a coherent defense east of the Seine and back toward the Moselle, could not hold. The Wehrmacht's ability to absorb punishment and reconstitute itself, that grim institutional talent, which had kept the German army fighting across 4 years of war, was failing. Under the weight of the pursuit, prisoners came in by the tens of thousands. Equipment was abandoned on roads, in fields, in the courtyards of villages, whose names the soldiers in those columns could not yet pronounce. Patton saw it. He understood, with the clarity that comes only to commanders who can read a collapsing army, that the moment was not infinite, that the German line, once it stabilized, would require a different and far costlier kind of warfare to break again. He asked for fuel. He asked for supplies. He told his superiors repeatedly, and without ambiguity, that if he were given the resources to maintain his rate of advance, he could drive to the Rhine perhaps to the Rhine and beyond, before the autumn rains came and the roads turned to mud and the enemy found its footing again. The requests were heard. Some were acknowledged. And then the advance had stopped. What stopped it was not German resistance. What stopped it was gasoline. The Allied logistical system, brilliant in many respects, had not been designed for an advance of this speed or this distance. The supply lines stretched back to Normandy, to the beaches, to ships that could only unload so much material each day. The Red Ball Express, the improvised convoy system of predominantly black American soldiers who drove trucks around the clock across hundreds of miles of French road, was extraordinary in its effort and heroic in its execution, but it could not conjure fuel from nothing. When Schaff made the difficult decision about how to allocate the fuel that was available, Patton's Third Army received less than Patton believed it needed, and less than Patton believed was fair. Priority shifted northward, the result of a broader strategic calculus involving multiple Allied commands, competing operational priorities, and pressure from the highest levels of the coalition. Among the operations drawing on those redirected resources was a combined airborne and ground assault through Holland, aimed at crossing the Rhine at Arnhem. Operation Market Garden. Market Garden was audacious. It was, in some respects, everything Montgomery's critics said he was too cautious to attempt. It was also, in the end, a failure. The bridge at Arnhem was held by German forces, stronger than intelligence had indicated, and the Allied paratroopers who dropped to seize it were cut off before the ground forces could reach them. The operation cost thousands of lives and gained nothing that could not have been gained by other means. Patton knew none of that with certainty. In September of 1944, what he knew was that his fuel had been redirected, that his army had been halted, and that men and momentum were being squandered on plans he had not been consulted about and did not believe in. He was, by the accounts of those who were with him, incandescent with fury. He was also, by those same accounts, disciplined in where he directed it. He did not go to the press. He did not write letters designed to embarrass Eisenhower. He complained to Bradley. He complained in his diary. He pushed every boundary of his authority to keep some element of his army moving forward. But there is something about what happened in that room, something that almost every account of this story leaves out. Because Patton didn't just defend Eisenhower. He said something about the nature of command itself, something the colonel would carry for the rest of the war. The room was private, the kind of room that exists in every headquarters, a space between the maps and the telephones, where the formal architecture of rank briefly relaxes and men speak with something approaching candor. The colonel, in these tellings, had served near Patton long enough to believe he had earned the right to speak. What he said was not tactical. It was not about fuel allocations or supply priorities or the merits of a northern versus southern axis of advance. It was something older and more personal than any of that. It was about trust, about what he believed had been done to a man he admired. He had watched Patton build something extraordinary, had watched the Third Army become a weapon, unlike anything the American military had produced, and he had watched it be stopped, not by the enemy, but by the men above them, men he believed who should have known better, men who should have been loyal. Eisenhower had betrayed him. The words sat in the air. Between them, Patton looked at him and told the colonel he was wrong. He did not say it loudly. Those who have reconstructed the texture of Patton's private speech, as opposed to the theatrical roar he deployed for effect, describe something different in moments like this, measured, almost judicial, as if the words were being chosen, not to wound, but to clarify. The word betrayal, Patton is understood to have said, required intent. It required a man who knew what he was doing to you, who chose it, who turned the instrument of his authority against you with full knowledge of the cost. That word had a specific weight, and it could not simply be transferred onto a decision made under impossible pressure by a man trying to hold a coalition together. He was not commanding one army. He was holding an alliance together. Eisenhower stood between governments, between national prides, between field commanders, each of whom believed, with some justification, that his theater was the decisive one. The choices that reached Patton's fuel depot did not begin with Eisenhower's preferences. They began with obligations that traveled all the way to Downing Street and the White House. A man in that position cannot simply follow the fastest horse. To fault him for not doing so is to fault him for having the job he had. He believed the decision was wrong. He said so, privately, loudly, repeatedly, in letters, in his diary, in conversations with Bradley, in every forum available to a general who had not yet lost the restraint that might have ended his career earlier than it did. He had made no secret of his disagreement, and he was not making a secret of it now. The fuel had been misallocated. The army that could have been at the Rhine was sitting in Lorraine. He would go to his grave believing that, but he had watched Eisenhower for years. He knew what drove him. He knew the care with which Eisenhower managed relationships that Patton himself would have long since burned down. He knew that Eisenhower had fought for the Third Army in rooms Patton never entered, had defended Patton's record when others in the coalition had called for his removal. A man who does those things has not stopped believing in you. A man who makes the wrong call under pressure is not the same as a man who turned against you, and treating them as the same, stripping the word betrayal of the intent it required, was not justice. It was grief, wearing the mask of accusation. The colonel did not respond immediately. There was, by the nature of the moment, nothing easy to say. He had come to Patton with a verdict and found himself handed back a question, not about Eisenhower, but about the difference between anger, which was legitimate, and moral condemnation, which required more evidence than a fuel allocation. Patton reframed what they were actually arguing about. Not betrayal versus loyalty, not Eisenhower versus the Third Army, but the harder, quieter problem of whether a wrong decision, made under pressure by a man of genuine responsibility, constituted a crime against the men it affected. He was saying it did not. He was saying that to call it betrayal was to use the strongest word in the vocabulary of soldiers, as though it were interchangeable with the merely mistaken or the merely insufficient. The colonel was not unconvinced. He was not entirely pacified either. He was a man who had watched something magnificent be stopped, and the grief of that did not dissolve, because Patton had named it more precisely. But something had shifted. Something had been distinguished that needed to be distinguished. The conversation ended, but the distinction it drew never did. The weeks and months that followed tested everything Patton is described as having said in that room, in Lorraine, fighting through the autumn mud, against a German army that had recovered much of its coherence. The Third Army demonstrated what it could do even under constrained conditions, grinding through fortified positions, maintaining pressure, refusing to be converted by logistics or weather into a static force. The supply situation remained difficult. Patton continued to push. He continued to complain. He continued to find the seams in whatever situation was handed to him. And then came December. The Ardennes, the German counteroffensive that the world would later call the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle ever fought by the American army, a crisis that threatened to split the Allied line, and which demanded, among other things, the fastest and most complicated military pivot in American military history. Patton turned 3 divisions 90 degrees in the middle of winter and drove them north into the flank of the German attack, relieving the siege of Bastogne in conditions that his own staff had called logistically impossible. It was, by any measure, the operational masterpiece of his career. In that moment, not in the clean advance of August, but in the brutal improvisation of December, the argument Patton had made in that quiet room found its vindication. Not that Eisenhower had been right in September, but that the army had survived September and had remained an army and had been capable of Bastogne because the men in it had not consumed themselves in recrimination. When the fuel ran out, command at the highest level is an exercise in incomplete information, competing loyalties, and decisions whose full consequences will not be known until they can no longer be changed. The men who exercise that command are not exempt from being wrong. They are not insulated from failure. They make choices that cost lives and opportunities, and sometimes the battles that might have ended wars sooner than they ended. What Patton understood, and what he reportedly tried in that private room to give to the colonel in front of him, was that anger at a wrong decision is not the same thing as moral condemnation of the man who made it. That the distinction matters enormously, not because the man who was wrong deserves to be protected from criticism, but because the soldier who cannot make that distinction loses the capacity for something essential, the ability to remain in relationship with the people he must work with, to trust without demanding perfection, to serve within a system larger than his own judgment, while still believing that his judgment has value. Patton was not a sentimental man. He was not by nature inclined toward forgiveness, or patience, or the slow wisdom of institutional thinking. He was, in almost every respect, the opposite. But in that conversation, accounts suggest, he drew a line that the colonel needed drawn, and that the history of that war, and perhaps of every war, needs drawn. The distinction Patton drew for that colonel was not a philosophical exercise. It was a survival skill for every man who commands and every man who serves. And the distinction Patton drew for that colonel was not a small one. It never is. If this conversation told you something about how great men disagreed, the next video goes deeper into what that partnership cost both of them, and which one of them was right.